Good afternoon. I am Brooks Berndt. I'm the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. We are delighted to welcome you to this installment of Creation Justice Webinars, the webinar where we seek to put faith into action for the greater good of humanity and our common home. As always, I am joined by my partner in justice, the Reverend Malcom, who puts the move into movement for this movement. He's always stirring things up. Michael, you are the executive director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and the People's Justice Council. You had the vision for today's webinar, and it just seems now like such a timely webinar because here we're approaching Earth Day. The United States is going to be hosting this global summit of leaders from around the world. And as we approach this, it seems like the topic to be thinking about is the kind of moral integrity our country is walking into this space. And I think this is now the time to really give that moral squint. I mean, if we are to be addressing the climate crisis, what do we need to be doing, and what's our responsibility if we're to be doing this in the right way, let alone being a leader in doing it? So, Michael, tell me your thoughts today.
Yeah, Brooks. What's fair? This question went through my head as I looked at the title of today's webinar. Fair is one of those multiple meaning type words, like Trump. And as I looked at the definition, I found that there was just two definitions that really, really stuck out and spoke to my theology. And I think that these two definitions set up our discussion today. One of the definitions is that fair is marked by impartiality and honesty. It's free from self-interest, prejudice, or favoritism. The other definition that stood out to me is that fair is open to legitimate pursuit, attack, or ridicule. I think both definitions call us to take a serious look within and own some truths. The former calls us to look at our governance, and the latter forces accountability. Truth. The US is one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. Truth. This pollution has caused global harm. Truth. The US made a pledge to participate in repair, and because of unwise decision-making from the past administration, the US pulled out on its pledge while continuing harm. Truth. We are the richest nation on the planet, and therefore we can do something about it. It's fair for us to call on the US to do what's fair, what's just, what's right. Communities of faith are called to be ambassadors of what's fair, what's just, and what's right. We're introducing this conversation today to provide you with advocacy tools to fulfill your sacred call to advocate for what's fair, what's just, and what's right. Thank you to Sivan, thank you to Jean, thank you to Susannah for being here. Thank you to Reverend Roberta for being here, and I look forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you, Michael, for that great introduction and framing. As always, you are a truth teller, and you are setting up some more truth tellers here today. I'm going to introduce our panelists today, and in doing so, after every introduction, I'm going to allow them to personalize it by answering the question, why are you here, other than getting an email from Michael or myself? What brings you to this work and to this conversation today? So up first, I'm going to introduce Sivan Kartha, who is a senior scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute, US. For the past 25 years, his research and publications have dealt with policy strategies for addressing climate change with an international scope and with a focus on equity and effectiveness. He is the co-director of the Climate Equity Reference Project, an effort focused on the political and ethical dimensions of equitably sharing the effort of an ambitious global response to the climate crisis. Among many notable highlights, he served as a coordinating lead author in preparing the fifth assessment report of the International Panel on Climate Change released by the United Nations. So Sivan, tell us, why are you here?
Thank you so much, Reverend Berndt and Reverend Malcom. I'm here because I can't think of a more important place to be. My own view about climate change and about our role in trying to decide, what do we do about it? It's changed a lot over time. And it was about 20 years ago that I spent a lot of time with a negotiator for the UN Climate Treaty. His name is Bo Kjellin. He's the lead negotiator for Sweden, and he's just a wonderful, wonderful man, just a wise man who was telling me about when he was in Rio negotiating the climate treaty. And they came out of that negotiation and their arms were linked, and they were just so proud of themselves for having kind of turned the corner and actually done something really important that signals a change in how we think about humanity's problems, including climate change, one of the single most important problems. There was really a feeling of solidarity among people of the world, and the negotiators that were representing them. And since 1992, a lot has changed. A lot has changed. And in the run-up to the Paris negotiations, the lead US negotiator was quoted as having said, "If equity's in, we're out." And that really kind of cuts at the heart, because too much has changed. Too much has changed in the wrong direction. And what it tells me is that, Reverend Malcom, what you said about governance and accountability being kind of key core things here, well, when the governance is not doing what it has to do, then who is it up to enforce that accountability? And it's us. It's us. Us is me, and us is all of you who I am just absolutely privileged to be here, and asked to have a discussion with. So thank you so much. Thank you for letting me be here in this really important and sacred space.
Thank you so much for that personalized introduction. We are grateful to have you with us. Up next, I'm going to introduce Jean Su, who is the Energy Justice Program Director and Staff Attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity. Her program work is dedicated to bringing about a clean, democratic energy future. In recent times, she has also worked to challenge wall construction on the US-Mexico border. She serves on the boards of the Climate Action Network International and Sustain US. Before joining the center, she worked as a renewable energy project finance attorney and in the climate change and international development fields of Africa and Asia. Jean, give us your personalized introduction. Why are you here today?
Great, thanks so much. Can you hear me now? Okay, beautiful. Just thank you so much to all the reverends who have invited us here. It's been really, it's been a really challenging time for everyone, and I really appreciate Sivan's grounding us and Reverend Malcom in grounding us in these really, in a really difficult and heartbreaking time, and for climate in particular, a catastrophe that has actually been affecting folks around the world for decades now. And my personal story with this begins, in 2005. So I started off my career wanting to serve in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, helping with microfinance programs for women. And at that time, that was all the rage because of what was happening with the Grameen Bank in India. and all these incredible developments that people were seeing, and women in particular in their empowerment. So I started off my career going to Madagascar to help set up those types of financial systems for women in rural areas. And what happened very quickly when I got there is within the first few months, a freak cyclone ended up hitting where we were, and it flooded all the way to my shoulders. So I'm 5 feet tall, and it basically got to 4 feet. And the women actually, it's a matriarchal society, so the women are mostly the farmers there. They had, yes, it is, Bill, it is. Okay, but okay, as an aside, they had just planted the rice for the harvest. And when it flooded to that very first cyclone, all of that had been wiped away. So essentially there was no food for the next year. And people, ended up making predatory loans with, some Chinese landowners there who had extra rice essentially, for in exchange for half of their land. So, for those who were able to get rice, they were able to eat for a few more weeks, but then, and also plant again. But then 3 weeks later, another cyclone hit. And within 6 months, 6 cyclones had hit the region that I was in. And what that actually looked like was just incredibly devastating. Basically, people had no food to eat. Everything had been wiped away. Homes, which were made out of bamboo, were completely devastated. Children got malaria and giardia because of all the types of water that had been built up. There were valleys of water that were so full of disease. And I actually ended up, doing emergency relief in these areas and going from village to village, but bathing in these waters that had built up, and there were mosquitoes and giardia and human feces all around me when I was basically there. And I say all of this to, as I was interviewing women throughout Madagascar, they were just saying again and again, the climate is changing. The climate is changing. We've never had this before. And for me, that was the first time that it really hit home what this palpably actually means. So when we talk about, fair shares and what it means to the world, I've seen in firsthand what it means to the world for people who actually didn't have any fossil fuel construction in their country, who barely can survive and raise their children. They did not cause the climate problem, but they are the ones who have suffered the most and first. And I always cry when I talk about this because I am here for those women who I fell in love with and who do not deserve this level of fragility that the United States and our biggest polluters have put them in. So I am here for them and for all the communities in the United States who also do not deserve what has happened to them. And we're here to fight it. And so I'm a lawyer, and I'm also a policy person, and I'm here to use the law to fight back and build with all of you the power to do it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jean, for that introduction. And now we will turn to Susannah, and I'll introduce Susannah, who will then not only give a personalized introduction, but will begin the presentations of today. Susannah Tuttle has directed North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light for 10 years. She is a founding member of the Southeast Faith Leaders Network and is an active member of the U.S. Climate Action Network. She currently serves on Interfaith Power and Light's National Board of Directors, Duke Energy's North Carolina Eastern Advisory Council, and the UNC School of Law's Center for Climate, Energy, Environment, and Economics Advisory Board. Before her present work, she served as UNC Chapel Hill's first Sustainability Research Associate. Susannah, what brings you here today?
Thank you. Well, first and foremost, it is a great honor and privilege to be with all of you. And I have so much respect. If I'm not presenting on these webinars, I am attending these webinars because what you all offer, Reverend Berndt and Reverend Malcom and Reverend Rominger, is just so sacred and such a huge part of why and how we are educating, inspiring, and mobilizing people of faith and conscience all over the country. So thank you. It's with gratitude that we're here. And then to get to be with my colleagues, Sivan and Jean, that is why I am here. I will follow these two into the desert and carry their bags doing it. I am here to talk about U.S. Fair Share, and I am the newest member of the team, as it were. I feel as though I found my tribe, and most certainly my ministry in spreading the gospel of the U.S. Fair Share, and how important it is for us to understand this as a person of faith and as someone who has a voice and must use it loudly and powerfully as a member of civil society. So my story begins in 2019. You heard my bio. I've been doing this work for a very long time, decades, and trying to do the best I can with the information that I had available to me. And it was at a U.S. Climate Action Network convening in St. Paul, Minnesota, where the keynote speakers were Tom Anathasu and Colette Pushan Battle on the big stage with hundreds of us in the room, listening to them present about global equitable climate finance. And as someone sitting in the room, taking it in and listening, I realized that I had I'd never received that presentation before. And ordinarily when we go into the breakout sessions, as we do, and can't wait to get back to conferences where we can be in person and, figure out where you're going to go in the building with the different sessions. I traditionally have been drawn to grassroots organizing and working with communities, by communities, for communities. And so ordinarily I would follow Reverend Malcom. We would go together down the hall to the Building Power from the Grassroots Up sessions. And I was so taken aback by how little I knew about equitable global climate finance that I went down a different hall and ended up in a session called From Bangladesh to Baltimore. And it was a presentation that went into a deeper dive around fair shares and what our accountability and responsibility is in the United States in relationship to the rest of the world. And that perception of international solidarity just permeated my soul. And I just wanted to learn more. And so I ended up following those folks out the door and trying to hang out with them for the rest of the conference. And I was like, tell me more. I need to know more. And I'll, before we launch into the brief presentation that we have for you today, I'll just say what really resonated and struck me so strongly is the work that we've been doing across religious denominations globally to pledge our divestment from fossil fuels and thinking about the way we use our resources and use our financial capital and our privilege in communities of faith to get out of fossil fuels, to help with the phase out and the mitigation of the climate crisis. But I haven't heard as much discussion around the reinvestment of those resources and what we're going to do. And I think this presentation, I hope, will capture your hearts and imaginations about what we can do. I've spoken in depth many times with both you, Reverend Berndt, and Reverend Malcom when we were in New York at the UN summit around climate finance. And I think the number that's floating around right now, I can confirm later, is about $57 trillion that the religious communities internationally has pledged in divestment. That's an enormous amount of resource that can be a part of addressing what the fair share is. And I think if any sector of society has a responsibility and a moral authority and accountability to address the climate crisis from a just perspective, it is the faith communities of the world. So with that, we are going to bring up the slideshow. Thank you for letting me tell my story, and hope to bring in all of you into the conversation as we go through the overview. So some of you are probably familiar with this presentation, and if you've been with us before, thank you. I can't hear it enough because there's a lot to learn here, and it is fairly complicated, but we're going to do our best to process this this data, these numbers in a way that we really want to get feedback from around how it resonates with you and how you feel you might be able to lead this conversation in your own community, because we need everybody to be having this conversation. So the US climate fair share to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. If you remember only one number from this whole presentation, this is the number to remember. We need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is the challenge of our lifetime. We are running out of time, and we need to be very, very, very active in making sure that the current administration understands that we can do this and we will do this if we can make sure that we move the political and public will to commit to doing this. So next slide. So I'm going to talk about the whys. There are 3 whys. And if you can go back to the previous slide, Sivan, there we go. We don't want to skip by the whys. Why? Because we care. So we do care. We know that this is the right thing to do. The US has a moral and legal obligation to protect human rights, which are threatened by the climate emergency. I know the story that Jean just shared, the story that Sivan shared, my personal story and my relationship to the people that I care, the people in the places I care and love about. It's the right thing to do. We're going to do it. And we're good people, and especially people of faith. We're going to do this. All right, we're on board with the why. It's also our overall historic responsibility. The US has released more global warming pollution than any other country and remains the world's 2nd highest emitter. China, yes, is the highest emitter, but has 4 times the population of the United States. So if we think about, you've done those global, how big is my carbon footprint? It's real, folks. And we have responsibility for that. We happen to be blessed to live in this country. And because of that, with great power comes great responsibility. We know that collectively. And then also from a financial capacity perspective, this is the part that was newer for me, and to think about this in terms of climate finance. And I'm not somebody who loves to talk about money, and I know how hard it is to talk about it in faith communities sometimes, but we have to understand and hold ourselves and this country accountable that the US is the world's wealthiest country, with much of that wealth concentrated in a small elite. And I want to emphasize that aspect of this, because I know many of us have been involved in conversations for a very, very long time about what's going on with Wall Street and what's up with this 1%, and why don't they care about anybody, and what are they using their wealth, their accumulated wealth, and they've made it off the backs of millions and millions of people, and historically. And that's a huge conversation to be having that we need to continue to have. And we have an opportunity in this moment to say, you know what, you have the money, and so this is how you need to use it. You owe it to yourself, you owe it to your family, you owe it to your neighbors, you owe it to the entire planet, every living being. So if you have accumulated wealth over any period of time, this is your chance to step in and do what is right and what is your responsibility. And those are the 3 whys that we really want to make clear, and stop, I'm ready to stop shaming the rich and say, you're rich, you have to pay for this. And so moving on to the next slide, what is our accountability? What is the responsibility? What is our US fair share? The US Climate Action Network spent a good part of 2020 educating ourselves, developing member alignment amongst over 190 organizations to come up with a position that clearly states that the US Climate Action Network believes that the US fair share of the global mitigation effort in 2030 is equivalent to a reduction of 195% below its 2005 emission levels, reflecting a fair share range of between 173 and 229%. Is this not the most complicated sentence you've ever read? Well, guess what? Sivan's going to explain it to you. So I'm handing it over to Sivan.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I get the fun part. So right, where does that number come from, and what does it have to do? What does 195% have to do with those kind of much more um, personally and sort of common sense, meaningful ideas that Susanna raised about responsibility and our country's wealth? How did we get those numbers? And you know what? Thankfully, it's simpler and more straightforward than you might think. Here's our starting point: that what the world needs to do, if we're serious about dealing with climate change and keep warming below 1.5 degrees, and we can definitely talk more about why that's so important, a limit to how much we mess up the climate system. It means reducing emissions from those just too high levels that they're going right now by about 36 billion tons of CO2. Maybe plus or minus one, but about 36 billion tons. And so what share of those reductions should the US do? And as Susanna pointed out, there are kind of two just really fundamental principles that come in trying to decide what is the US's fair share of that 36 billion tons of reductions that need to be done, that 36 billion tons worth of investment and energy efficiency and rethinking how and what we consume. What is the US's fair share of that? Well, how much of the mess did we make? What is our responsibility for it? Well, if you look at emissions since about 1950, that's about 2/3 of all emissions of carbon dioxide that have been emitted into the atmosphere and have kind of overloaded the atmosphere and the climate system. The US is responsible for, something like a bit more than 1/3 of it. Comparing to China, comparing to India, comparing to the EU, comparing to every other country, a bit more than 1/3. If you look at how much of the world's capacity we have to help clean up that mess, except let's be fair about this. The capacity of a very poor person or a poor household or a poor community, we can't just think of it as something that's available to help solve this global problem, because there are some basic needs that have to be met. So think of a person's capacity or a country's capacity as the resources it has, which is just best measured in terms of its income, that it isn't already allocating to just basic developmental needs. And when you compare across the world, it turns out that the US has a bit more than 1/3 of the global income that's not going into meeting basic needs, that's actually going into more discretionary things, or even into more luxury types of things, like second and third and fourth houses and private planes and levels of consumption that correspond to throwing out perfectly good things just so you can get the newfangled version of it. And so if the US has about a third, a little more than 1/3 of the responsibility for making the mess, and also, as it turns out, about a little more than 1/3 of the global capacity to help clean it up, well, kind of makes sense that we should be responsible for about 1/3 of those reductions. About 1/3 of the reductions, a little bit more, is about 14 billion tons. 14 billion tons corresponds to 195% reduction in our own emissions. Now, the reason why Susanna referred to a range around that is because, maybe it's not exactly 1/3, because it kind of depends on how we define capacity. How much do we exclude of a person or a household or a country's income on the basis that it's really going toward basic needs? And the Climate Action Network in the US had kind of a long discussion about what does that mean? What does it exclude? How do you compare, in other words, a dollar earned by a poor person to a dollar earned by a rich person? And you know what? This is a very, very, very common moral question. It's a question that we in sort of our national politics are always talking about. We talk about, how does taxation work? What should the tax rate on a very rich person be compared to a poor person? What should the poverty line be below which we just say, kind of income is exempt? You need to spend that on food and shelter and healthcare and education. So maybe it's a little more than a third, maybe it's a little less than a third. It's about 195%. There was a lot more kind of ethical discussion that went into that, but remarkably, even across a pretty wide range of perspectives on how precisely we should think about responsibility and capacity, it wasn't a radically wide range that would lead to radically different answers. They all hovered around a third. And so what does that 14 billion tons worth of helping the world solve its emissions problem, what would it look like in the US? Well, one way to look at it is to look at where US emissions are and how they've been moving. They've been coming down very slowly over the last 20 years or so, very slowly. Partly that's because, we have more solar panels on people's rooftops now than we used to have. We have more wind farms in the Midwest than we used to have, or on our coastlines. It's also because coal has become less competitive compared to natural gas largely. But it's been inching down, but it's not going where it needs to be. And in fact, it's on the way back up again. And so if we were to do about 14 billion tons of reductions relative to where it's going, that would mean reducing it from about 7 billion tons of emissions to about -7. And so there is a question to ask, well, what does that even mean? Can we even do that? Does this just tell us that the problem can't be solved and we can't do our fair share? No, that's not at all what it means. It means that in addition to some really, really, really ambitious and earnest and good faith efforts made in reducing our own emissions, there is a lot more that the US can do by cooperating with other countries, with poorer countries, with countries with less as far as responsibility for causing the problem, and less as far as income to deal with the solutions that are needed. And as Jean pointed out, they also tend to be the ones that have just a much, much higher level of pain and suffering that comes from the impacts of climate change. And these are the countries, the poor countries, that really need our financial, our technological, our institutional, our policy support, assistance, and cooperation, so that they too can get their own economies, which are hopefully growing, so they can meet more of their basic needs and start establishing a certain level of economic security, so they can get onto a pathway that's consistent with keeping global emissions below a 1.5 degree level of warming. So together with a lot of work helping to solve the climate problem at home, a lot of work cooperating with developing countries to reduce their own emissions and get onto a resilient pathway, that amounts to 195% reduction, or about 14 gigatons worth of reductions. And so altogether, this thoughtful, deliberative process that U.S. Climate Action Network has gone through over the course of the past year, the U.S.'s fair share would mean about a 70% reduction at home by 2030, and then another 125% worth of emissions reductions through cooperating with poorer countries. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Jean.
Great. So the question is how are we going to reach these very ambitious but necessary numbers that Sivan has outlined for us? There are a couple of answers to that, and it is definitely complex and robust and interesting. This is a picture of basically, in the next several pictures will be pictures of what has happened at international climate conferences that we've all heard about in the newspaper. There's an element, before we go into kind of the policy aspects of this, there is an element that is about building the people power that we need to actually influence our own government here and other governments abroad to do something. So this is a picture from, I believe, the New York action, the New York Climate Conference that happened a few years ago. And our great friends at Action Aid came together from all parts of the world to come and protest for greater action. And then Sivan, do you want to go ahead to the next slide as well? Great. And this one is from Poland, actually, and I believe our campaigner took this picture in which a bunch of the climate activists who were there at the climate conference from all parts of the world came together to jam up the conference and basically say that the people are asking for far much more than what politicians can give us. Sivan, the last slide there. Thank you. Okay, beautiful. So I think the last COP conference that occurred was in Madrid, and basically I was part of the group that helped plan probably the biggest protest and action that has been at a climate change conference. What usually happens is that it is a closed black box of conference rooms that are set up and people in suits, and then they allow for some civil society advocates to come in. And what has repeatedly happened over the years is that the politicians are just not responsive. And so what we did is that we actually, hundreds of us actually gathered in front of the conference meeting space, the big space, to block people from getting in. And it was essentially a way to say, the world is watching you. The people who actually are suffering from this are watching you. And we refuse for you to go into this negotiation and continue to ignore us. We all came together in front of that conference space, and the police essentially put us, you'll see this is outside. There's a gate right there to the left. We didn't realize there was a gate when we were all inside, and the police essentially opened up this gate and herded us like cattle to outside the conference space. And it was, I think, around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So we did not have our coats. It was a total human rights violation. And yet all of us came out here and still protested, and they marched us around that conference space for around 4 hours without our coats and banned us from getting into the conference again. All of this is to say, there is a huge, huge need for people to rise up and actually demand justice, because people in the negotiation rooms are not listening, and they have not listened for decades. So what can we do? There are many different things we can do. And Sivan, do you want to go to the last slide? So Susannah will go through these in particular, but essentially we have kind of two ways to look at this. One is we have a domestic reduction that Sivan has outlined. We need to cut down by 70%. Many of us have crafted plans that can actually reach that 70%. And what it essentially boils down to is common sense. Stop fossil fuels from being extracted from the ground and combusting them. That is super common sense, yet our capitalist system here refuses, and our politicians that are captured by that refuse to do it. But that is the first and most important step: stop the fossil fuels. The second step, of course, is what are we going to replace with those fossil fuels? a truly renewable energy system that is climate resilient. As my Reverend Malcom was talking about before, there is this concept of energy burden in this country. And what that means is that it is the amount of income, or is the amount of electricity spending that a family does over their income. In this country, there are Black communities and Latino communities suffer energy burdens that are 1.5 to 2 times higher than white families. And what that means is that they have higher electricity bills, but it means that they also can't pay for their electricity, and they actually disproportionately get cut off. They also disproportionately suffer from the fossil fuel pollution in their backyard. And of course, they are also live in communities that disproportionately suffer from climate disasters. So think the Gulf, think the flooding that happens all across North Carolina and other southern states, and the Black Belt generally. So what that means when we talk about a new energy system, we need to hit all of those things all at once. We need to stop the pollution, we need to stop the energy burden, disproportionate impacts, and we need to actually get people climate resilient systems. That looks like rooftop solar, community owned generation that basically no longer relies on fossil fuel generation and actually has proven technologies like solar and wind to help us get us out of this mess. So that is what our energy future needs to look like. It needs to be climate resilient, and it needs to resolve and address finally the energy violence and racism that our current energy system completely relies upon. And unfortunately, that is a system that the Biden administration continues to perpetuate and support. So these are kind of 2 parts of the pie that we absolutely need for domestic reductions. We can totally talk about that more. And then the second part is the international reductions that Sivan was talking about. We actually need to put in the finance as well as give the technologies, the clean energy technologies, and the technological support to help countries do the same thing that we are doing, phase out their fossil fuel production and leapfrog over to a clean and resilient energy system as fast as possible. So with that was a lot. And we can talk about that a lot more.
Preach. Oh my. I hope that everybody on this call is getting geared up for the hope and prayer that we have, that is every Earth Day sermon of this month that's going to happen all across the country. We would love to hear that preached from the pulpit, because that's exactly the call to action that we need. And as people of faith and conscience, we know that we can do this. We have the hope, we have the faith, we have the trust, and everything that Jean just said is possible. It is all possible. And so what we need to do now is organize, mobilize, and the story of getting pushed out of a event that should be really by the people, for the people, and getting pushed out into the street in the cold, and an international discussion about how to care for the planet and the people in the places that we love is just, we need to shift this on its head, and we can do this. So moving forward, we have some asks of you, of course. And the first one is, and they're all easy. You can do them today from the comfort of your own home. The first one is, and I'm dropping all of this in the chat right now, is to endorse the sign-on letter demanding the Biden administration commit to the US climate fair share. Even if you didn't completely feel as though you understand, what's 195% mean? It's about the values behind this. It's about knowing the whys, those 3 whys of it's the right thing to do. We have historic responsibility, and we have the capital to do it, and we can mobilize the capital to do it. And we do know, we're hearing from Special Envoy John Kerry and others about the importance to bring in the multi-sector aspect of how we're going to solve this. I think we all know that we can't just look to the government to fix everything in the world. We have to be a part of that process. And the way that we can be a part of that process right now is by making sure that the administration understands that this is what we're asking for. So please make this ask, sign this letter. This letter is deadline to be signed is tomorrow. So this is something you need to do today, and you need we ask that you share it with everyone you know. The more voices that the administration is asking to hear from us has been very, very clear with that. So that's very important. The next piece I'll drop into the chat is, and then we're going to go to question and answers, but I just want to make sure you get all these resources, is today is the National Day of Call-in. So this is the perfect day to have this event, take action, tell President Biden to put forward an NDC that does our fair share. So this is information with a script and resources, and we have a toolkit that I'm going to drop in right now, a social media pack that's been put together so that you can amplify this, and who we can tweet at, and who we can Insta at, and Facebook at, and do all of this at the same time. Are these only going to panelists? Yes, they are. Darn it, I'm doing them all right now again. I'll do that during the question and answer. I get so excited I didn't hit the panelists and attendees aspect of this. And then this document I'll just speak to quickly, as Jean did, panelists and attendees, got it, is the Share Fair Nationally Determined Contribution Model resource that personally I believe is one of the most beautiful documents that has ever been compiled. It tells the story of the why, of the how, and it's clearly breaks it into digestible content that we need to be educating ourselves about. And so I'm going to be very happy to offer educational opportunities to walk through the document, but wanted to make sure you have it. And there is, as I mentioned, a social media pack that goes along with it. The US has not publicly launched our NDC, which is essentially what's putting us back into the Paris Agreement, how we're telling the story at a domestic level and at an international level of what we're contributing. What are we going to do? This is the document that says what we are pledging to do. And my understanding is it's going to be launched as part of the Biden summit that will be happening on Earth Day. So it is not yet finalized. And so if you take a look at this Fair Share NDC and understand that this is really what we need to be doing, hopefully you'll be able to use that social media pack to help amplify that and be able to let people like Gina McCarthy and John Kerry and President Biden and others know that we care about this, especially from a faith community perspective. So with that, I'll keep dropping things into the chat. I know Sivan and Jean are really excited to answer your questions, and we can stop the message. And yes, in the chat box, I will also remind people what NDC stands for. And maybe Jean, if you just want to jump into that, and Sivan, Scott, sharing your screen, and we can go back into the discussion portion.
Yeah, thank you so much to all three of you for those great presentations. We've got lots of questions. I think one place to start out with is we have a couple of questions just asking you to spell out more what international cooperation looks like. And in particular, I'd be curious, to know what's this green climate fund we hear about sometimes. So feel free. Sivan, do you want to take that on first?
Sure thing. Yeah, it's a really good question. And the reason why it's such a good question is because it really means like doing things and thinking about things and creating ways of interacting with other countries that are not how we've historically done things. And the first thing that immediately comes to mind is money into the Green Climate Fund, which is it's part of the UN Climate Treaty. It's an institution, a mechanism that's set up to provide support to developing countries. And yes, it's a good idea. It's an important thing to do. But if we're talking about the changes that are needed in order to get the world onto a pretty fundamentally different development path, it definitely means something different than writing a few $billion checks into in many ways very conventional financial institution. And so there are a few things I would say have to be part of this kind of whole way of thinking about cooperating with other countries to shift their development pathways. One thing is that first and foremost, we got to build some trust. We got to build some trust about our cooperation with developing countries being in the spirit of solidarity and to help solve a global problem. You know, much of US development aid, much of it has done good things, but much of it has also been really first and foremost to advance US's own international relations interests and political demands. Which countries it's allocated to, which ones it's not allocated to, how much of it goes into military support. And these things need to start changing. It needs to very clearly be toward the interest of global solidarity. Another thing the U.S. has to start building trust is to show that the U.S. itself is genuinely shifting its own development pathway. So it has to occur concurrently with those deep reductions that are happening at home. We can't be seen to be kind of coasting along with very high consumption lifestyles and offsetting all our emissions reduction work to other countries. That won't fly. That won't fly. A second thing that we need to do is, well, as you know, the Hippocratic Oath says, first do no harm. We have to stop putting U.S. financial resources into continuing to build up the fossil fuel basis of the global economy. We still have US-based multinational corporations that are investing in more exploration, investing in more extraction of fossil fuels, and that this can no longer be a main way that the US financially interacts with the rest of the world. There are other ways that US investments continue to kind of buttress and build up a fossil-based economy. Much of the way that we advance a global agricultural system has to do with a particular model of agriculture that's very much based on very fossil-intensive ways of cultivating, processing, transporting, distributing food. And there are other very successful models of agriculture, of food production, of food systems that have been demonstrated. Models that are based on much more agricultural diversity, much more integration with local ecosystems, much less reliance on single crop monocultures, much less reliance on highly intensive, highly fossil intensive inputs. So that's one example. Another way that the US has to change the way it cooperates is in the whole system of technological innovation. Right now, the bulk of technological innovation is done, you know, technological innovation happens, and it happens very effectively and happens very efficiently, but toward the aims of the, you know, next quarter profits of the corporations who invest the bulk of resources into innovation. The amount of resources that are invested in innovation in the public interest, whether that's dealing with tropical diseases or whether that's dealing with let's say human settlements that are much more resilient in the face of flooding and hurricanes, or whether that's innovation in the interest of making solar systems and wind farms much cheaper and more efficient. These are things that are right now, all of that happens through a system where the primary filter is near-term profitability. So these are ways that don't actually have to do with writing checks into some existing financial institution. That said, yes, a lot of it will involve financial cooperation. Jean had mentioned that right now, the way that we see the global distribution of renewable energies is through winning market share for US corporations. Current climate policy, to the extent that it thinks about international things, it's kind of framed in terms of winning market share and winning a race to the future. And if this remains kind of conceived of as a race, as a competition, then it'll be very difficult to win the trust and establish genuine cooperation with countries that we need to have the trust of, and we need to win the cooperation of if we're going to solve this global problem. Something that's really important to recognize is that even though we have such a large share of the global responsibility for causing the problem and capacity to solve the problem, we and other wealthy countries have the majority, the lion's share of that. Most of the actual emission reductions that have to happen in developing countries. Developing countries is where energy demands are growing most rapidly, where there are plenty of basic energy needs that still need to be met, and where there are genuine and legitimate aspirations for establishing some level of prosperity. And that's a fundamental mismatch. The ethical responsibility is in one set of countries, the actual action is in another set of countries, and the only way to reconcile that is via a global system of cooperation that allows this to be undertaken in some kind of a sort of on some kind of a basis of solidarity. Those are a few ideas about international cooperation, and there's definitely more that can be said about that, including what would the financial mechanisms look like if they were scaled up from the scale of sort of scattered projects here and there being financed to the scale of entire overhauls of a country's electrical sector, or a country's the transport sector in major developing country cities or such.
Wow, we have got so much to think about today. It's been a very rich conversation. We are nearing the end of our time here today. So I want to say one quick innovative addition we have to this month's Creation Justice webinar. We're always looking to do more than just talk, and to also do some acting. And so we invite people to stick around once this hour is over. Feel free to stick around. The Reverend Roberta Rominger is going to kind of host us for those who want to take action, to do some of these actions that have been put before us. What better way to do it than to do it right now, and to not put it off for tomorrow? And so Roberta, we're going to hand the mic over to Roberta in 1 minute when we wrap up. So please do stick around so we can really put our faith into action on this one, and learn what we can do, and to really sit down and click on some of those links and contact some elected officials and make some endorsements. And so we'll be doing that in just a second. But for now, let me just give a really large thank you to our three panelists. You have been excellent, terrific. There more questions than we could have gone to, because it was just such a rich conversation. And this is new for a lot of us, I think, to think about, and that's why it's so important for us to think about, so that we can really wrestle with these issues and do what needs to be done to stand with moral integrity, and to call on our elected officials to do so, because it's urgent that we do so. And so thank you again, everyone.